And in 2016, she was appointed as chair in university teaching at Ottawa. And one of the things I liked from her website is that she was actually one of her earliest awards was the Science Students Association Professor of the Year Award in 2008. So she's somebody with a long track record in teaching. She's a broad range of interests, but I think she's quickly emerged as one of the leading voices in organic chemistry education, looking at things like how people approach organic mechanisms, the approach to teaching mechanisms, and looking at how students approach synthetic work. She's spoken at numerous conferences, and I actually saw her at a GRC conference a few years ago as an amazing talk, and she's headlining at the ICC in Sydney next year. So this is somebody very much at the top of her game. So really looking forward to hearing her speak. The way we'll run the session is you've all kind of got used to the chat box. Obviously, because there's so many people, we'll have to go by a text route. So as you think of questions, just post them in the chat box. I'll make a note of them, and every so often we'll stop and we can have a discussion with Alison about some of the questions that arise. So as you think of questions, feel free to post them in the chat area. So that's it, Alison. I'm happy to pass over to you. I think your webcam, if you can turn it on, that'd be great. But if not, we will get going. And welcome to Alison, and we look forward to hearing your talk.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. All the tech working here? I can keep going?
Yeah, we can hear you, and the slide looks great.
Super. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining this webinar. This is a fantastic opportunity. So I've divided the talk into an introduction and then two main projects that I'll be talking about. So I'll be stopping after those two main projects, certainly as planned, and then Michael will jump in, as he mentioned, if there's other appropriate points to have some question, answer, and discussion. So if I talk a little bit about our group and our work to start here. I'm learning how to advance the slide. There we go. So our group, we really focus on learners' challenges in organic chemistry especially, and their goals, either their goals for the specific course, for future courses, for their careers. And we think about those students as scientists, as non-scientists. We're also thinking about their lifelong learning skills as well as their chemistry knowledge and skills. And so we try to explore those challenges through our own research, qualitative and quantitative research methods, and we're always drawing from existing educational research and specifically chemistry education research. And as we start to uncover some of those students' challenges, we go into developing, it could be online learning tools or pedagogical methods or curricula to try to support students getting toward their goals. Then we can go back and evaluate those developments to see to what extent they might be and hopefully are effective for students, their learning and their experiences. So as we're approaching those research questions, there's a couple of main frameworks that we think about. And the first main one, if I click slide advance, here we go, is chemistry's triplet. So thinking about that interconnection between the macroscopic and the submicroscopic levels, and then all those symbols and representations that we use to represent the macroscopic and the submicroscopic levels. And as experts, we use those symbols or those representations that best suit a given purpose, and we can interconvert between those different representations. But our students, for them, it's almost like working in a second language, and they can get really left behind as we convert between all these different representations, or even interpreting a single one. So we think a lot about that. The other thing that we're thinking a lot about is around information processing theory, which would talk about how with all these things all this information that's coming at us all the time, some of that gets transferred into our working memory. We can think about different ideas, pull from our existing knowledge, and some of that's thinking that's gone on in our working memory can get transferred or encoded in our long-term memory. And if it were as simple as that, we would be like robots. Learning and teaching would be very easy. But we know that we're not robots, and so we think more about modern information processing theory and the connection with meaningful learning. And so here we think about that information that's transferred, if it's perceived as meaningful, either consciously or subconsciously, how we as learners build on our prior knowledge, how we can choose to make connections to our existing knowledge in many different ways, with the social interactions that are very key in that way, and how we would integrate the cognitive, psychomotor, and affective domains to really have that deep and meaningful learning experience. So to dig a little bit more into that working memory, that's holding and processing new and existing information. And I'll ask for those of you who are willing, and I saw some of you from Miami who are perhaps here and have done this before, if you could take about 10 seconds and memorize that number for me. So when I've shown this slide at other places, one of the very common ways for people to say these numbers that they've remembered over that period of time is to split it up in a cadence, so 7, 9, 2, 1, 6, 4, 8, 5, 3. And that's a very typical way of segregating or chunking information to help us remember it more easily. You might alternatively have rearranged the numbers to make them easier to remember, which is not that helpful if the order is meaningful. So that's something for symbols that are familiar to us. And then we might look at symbols that are perhaps less familiar to us. And if I asked you to memorize that particular string of numbers, perhaps that would be a little bit harder for you to do. And then if we take that into a chemistry context and think about what our learners might experience for a moment, and if for a second I say, we're going to make all these things reversed or backwards, our typical chemistry symbols. And if I show this next one on screen here, and I ask you to interpret this particular diagram, I've applied a single rule to our typical symbols, so they're just backwards. And I've seen in the room sometimes when I've talked about this, I've seen people get kind of uncomfortable and look like, oh, what is this? This doesn't make any sense. That might be what our learners are experiencing as they're trying to decode some symbols here. And so then we can make it more typical. And as those become more normal and more natural to us, you can stop working to try to decode what's going on here, and you can think about the product, the next series of reactions, something totally different. All of it becomes that much easier. So that's what we're really looking for here, knowing that students can really struggle to decode these symbols and representations, or chemistry's language. But if they were fluent, then their working memory could be dedicated to grappling with those more difficult concepts rather than spending all this time thinking about those symbols. So that's one thing that we think about quite a bit. The other piece that we're thinking about is around reactivity and reactions. And that reactivity and reactions that can seem like random, completely unconnected facts where students are working to memorize with flashcards or making themselves huge lists or tables or diagrams just for the exam and then forgetting afterwards and not being able to go much more beyond that static or very product-oriented kind of thinking. And instead, what we're hoping to see is that students be able to interpret and predict relative reactivity, even for things they haven't seen before, that they be able to find patterns of reactivity, that they think in a more process-oriented sort of way, and that for the things that they're talking about, these chemical phenomena, these chemical reactions, that they be able to talk about these reactions from a how and also the why perspective. What's causing these reactions? What's driving these reactions? How can we understand that? How can we predict those things, even if we haven't seen that given situation before? So these are some of the things that we certainly would hope for. So in a new curriculum that we developed and implemented a few years ago now at the University of Ottawa, we start with structure at the very beginning, like as we do with most curricula. Then we explicitly teach that language of organic chemistry piece, so that what and where. And then we get into the reactivity, the how and the why. Now, I'll spend a lot of time talking about the language of organic chemistry today, but it doesn't actually take that much of curricular or instructional time. So if we take a look at more of a timeline of our curriculum. In Organic 1, we spend almost half talking about structure, then about a course looking at the language, and then we start getting into reactivity in the rest of Organic 1, with structure and language still underpinning that reactivity piece and still assessing on all of those pieces. And then in Organic 2 and Organic 3, there's still a really big focus on that reactivity piece, but always with structure and language underpinning that part of instruction, part of assessment. So if we dig more deeply now into those language learning outcomes, we have four very specific ones that we might think about. One is that students be able to draw the electron pushing arrows, given the starting materials and products of that given step of the reaction. That they be able to draw products, given the starting materials and the electron pushing arrows, draw the transition state structure, and then draw the reverse mechanism. So it's always for new reactions, but the key is that students are really, they're interpreting what's happening within a single reaction step and interpreting the symbolism. It's not relying on their memory of what they've seen in past reactions. So as we started thinking this was a good idea to help students become more fluent, we had, of course, some research questions that came up. So the first couple, we were thinking about what are student success rates in solving these symbolism type questions, what are students' strategies and errors, and then we wanted to keep digging more deeply to understand what students are really thinking, what meaning they were constructing. And so in these first two questions, we've had quite a number of students working on this area. Whenever we're approaching any of our projects, we work really hard to align all the different research components. So starting with the problem that we're trying to address, perhaps intended learning outcomes, there we can design our research questions, think about the appropriate framework or frameworks that we might want to use, and then starting to make choices around the data collection method, the instruments, the specific items, and getting into data analysis. And especially in choosing this data collection method and the items we might want to ask, it can get really exciting to ask all sorts of different questions and then explore the data in all sorts of different ways, but we really try to be very focused. If there's something that we want to ask about, an interview question we want to have, we go right back to that research question and ask ourselves if those two things are aligned. And we end up having to either throw out a number of items or an instrument that might seem really attractive to use that we just can't because it's not aligned with our research questions. Or maybe we realize in that process that we actually are trying to ask something different. And so it might actually be our research question that's being revised. But this alignment piece is a really important thing that we continually cycle back to during our projects. So specifically for these two research questions, we're talking about participants, students from Organic Chemistry 1 and 2 courses. They were drawn from sections that were taught with a flipped format. We always get ethics approval for all of our projects. The first two questions, the data came from exam analysis, and we ended up having about 2,500 arrows type questions and then about 4,000 draw the products type questions. So one of the things that was quite revealing to us, I guess, was plotting the scores for the students' questions against their average assessment, midterm or exam scores. And we expected, because these types of questions, these symbolism questions, were giving all the information we felt to solve the problem. So for example, the arrows questions gave the starting materials and products of a given reaction step. The students just had to look between in that single step, what was happening to those electrons, those bonds, and draw in the arrows. We felt that all the scores on those arrows questions should be higher than all of their exam score questions. Those questions like synthesis questions and predict a mechanism for a completely unknown reaction, we thought those would be a lot harder. So those would pull the exam scores down. So we expected the question scores to be all above that y equals x axis, y equals x line. What we found was a little bit different than that. Certainly the average arrow scores, which were around 82%, were higher than the average exam scores, but there was still a lot of scores below that y equals x line. And then even more so for the products type of questions, we saw students really struggling with these kinds of questions. And so that's something that we chose to investigate more fully. So there were certainly some promising results. So one is a couple of things that we really saw: very few reversed arrows, very few pentavalent atoms. So some of the common things we had seen previously, really we just aren't seeing those kinds of things anymore, kind of in the 1 to 2% level. And then we're seeing lower scores correlated with either questions that have implicit atoms and electrons, those hydrogen and carbon atoms that are embedded in line structures, or lone pairs that are not explicitly drawn, or with intramolecular reaction steps. To give a couple of examples here, this is a question, it was a bit of a longer question. This is part of the question that was asked. In black is what the students were given, and they were asked to draw in the electron pushing arrows. So we were looking for them to expand the structure, map to see what had changed between the starting materials and products, and then draw in the arrows. We were marking only the arrows portions. And what we found was that fewer than 50% of students were able to correctly get the full answer. Some students had a partial answer, like in number 2. Some misinterpreted the symbolism, as in number 3. So we saw quite a variety of other answers there. Another place was that with those intramolecular questions where we saw those lower scores. So for example, on a final exam in 2014, the median score was 100%. And it seems like just because of a changed conformation, it was still in a final exam, just a year later, same kind of preparation. Here the median score was 0%. So these kinds of questions were certainly correlated with lower scores. Then we went deeper and looked at the strategies that students were drawing in their answers, and we saw that across the boards were attempting these questions, but much fewer were drawing in lone pairs or expanding bonds and atoms, the kinds of things we'd want to see them doing to be able to figure out what had happened in a question. Very few have redrawn the structure, shown any evidence of mapping. So these kinds of strategies that we've seen associated with higher success in other question types, like synthesis questions, we don't see any evidence of students doing them on their exam papers. They might be doing them in their heads, but we're not seeing them here. So having learned a fair bit from these things, from these two research questions, we wanted to go deeper and figure out what kind of meaning students were constructing. And so here we had two other students who were involved in this project, Kelly Galloway and Carly Stoyanovich. And to get at this meaning, to really understand how students are thinking, we went to interviews. So it was the same question type. This time, only Organic Chemistry 1 students. There were almost 30 participants. Interviews that were audio recorded. And once we had those recordings, we transcribed all the recordings, and then we analyzed them. So we went through a coding process and then analysis process, looking for themes and categories. So from that, and I'll just briefly summarize the findings from that interview portion. Across all the interviews, we saw students focusing on electron movement and on process, and we were really excited to see that part because they weren't just focused on the outcome. They were working their way through that process. Some of the other things that we saw, so we called these stepwise, mapping, charges, and chemistry reasoning. And just to touch briefly on a couple of these. With stepwise, what we saw students doing was breaking a question up into steps in a way that we hadn't seen on exams before. So for example, pulling the electrons up onto the rightmost carbon of that left-hand double bond, drawing in the lone pairs, not always, but at least talking about those that lone pair being there, and then cyclizing to the product. So we call that a stepwise approach. We're not sure if students are just doing that as a pen and paper kind of strategy, or if that's actually how they're thinking about a chemical reaction occurring. That didn't come out in these particular interviews. The other thing that we saw was mapping, and we saw that students, as in this case, if they were not thinking very much about electron movement, or they weren't considering the electrons in their mapping, that they tend to map incorrectly, as in this example. Whereas if students were thinking about both the atoms and electrons, those are the students who tended to be more successful in their mapping. Charges, we saw that students were using them both as a cue of where a reaction had taken place, I think as any of us would do. But those charges also acted as a barrier. So if students, for example, did not see an explicit charge, they could struggle to figure out what was happening in the reaction, or they would create a charge to then have it react. And then in the interviews, we saw students leveraging or trying to leverage their chemistry reasoning, not always correctly, but always trying to do so. And this came out in different little parts of the interviews, and it was something that we really wanted to dig more into in the future, because we felt like we didn't really understand as much as we'd like to how they were pulling from their prior knowledge. So in terms of next steps, we have an open access resource called orgchem101.com, where students can learn organic nomenclature, the symbolism of organic reaction mechanisms, and organic acid-base chemistry. These both have videos and interactive questions for the students. So we'd like to expand on these as one next step. Then the other thing is that we have a number of remaining research questions. So evaluating OrgChem 101, further exploring some of those qualitative research findings, connecting between the tools and symbolism, synthetic strategies and skills, and looking more carefully at how students and professors are reading, if you will, different chemical reactions that they're seeing. If we get in a little bit more into the implications for learning and assessment, in particular with that module that we have, we emphasize to students that they should be expanding and mapping as an effective strategy, and yet we don't really know the extent to which they're actually doing that, maybe in their heads, but we're really not seeing much on on exams. So what we're starting to do is assess explicitly for that, asking them not only to predict the product, but also to show their mapping and assigning points for that. The other thing that we're doing is using this kind of questions to also help talk about mental models. So we might ask students either draw the arrows in, or conversely to draw the products of a given reaction in, and then starting to ask them what description is most accurate. If a bond forms and then a second bond breaks, if the inverse happens, as in example B, or if these things are happening simultaneously. And often we can see first that the answers that students have provided, that most students were answering, this came from a class, most students are answering that first the oxygen-carbon bond is forming and then the carbon-chlorine bond is breaking, rather than fewer students who are saying that these are breaking simultaneously. And so this was an opportunity for us in class then to be talking about concerted reaction steps, transition states, even early and late transition states if it's in an appropriate part of the course, but really taking this opportunity to dig into students' thinking and really talk about what's happening in chemical reactions. So that brings us to the end of the description of the first project. I'm going to pause here before we dive into this second project to see where you're at and what kind of questions may be coming up.
Yes, I mean, there's quite a lot of activity going on, so I will try and summarize some of the questions, but yeah,
Okay.
certainly a very popular topic. I think there's a couple of different categories, so I might try and bring them together. The first
Sure.
was just, I suppose, this idea of the underpinning rationale and this idea of information processing and language. I mean, one thing that struck me, and it was a sort of a follow-on question, was in terms of working memory, the direction of the arrow is, the placement of the arrow is one thing, and then there's a direction, which is an additional thing. And Sheila had a comment, which I think you addressed, about whether you show non-bonding electrons, for example, because is that extra noise? So to what level do you consider these working memory considerations in categorizing the difficulty of a particular mechanism? I suppose was one general. I might just leave that with you for a second. One general question. Then there was a question on, I suppose, the research approach, and you mentioned something about cycling back to alignment. Do you pre-plan that, or do you see how, or do you kind of do it as you're doing the research? And then there were a couple of kind of practice-focused questions, which I'll come back to after those two. So the first is essentially a little bit more of a discussion around working memory, things like are showing lone pairs extraneous loads. How do you consider not just the placement of an arrow, but also the direction of an arrow, that kind of thing? I hope I've summarized them.
Yep, yeah, for sure. And I'm just writing down some of my thoughts here. And direction, you said. Okay, so I think one of the great things about the formalism that we use in organic chemistry is we can really explicitly show how these bonds are forming and breaking. The unfortunate thing is that we talk about a nucleophile attacking an electrophile, and we show these arrows that start from electrons and go at an atom, when really if we were going to help students develop stronger mental models, I think we would be showing molecular collisions and giving a sense of reaction speeds. And so I think the formalism that you use is really limited, and so as any of the representations that we use are very limited. So I think it's so important that we talk both about the strengths of the representations that we use and also their limitations. It's one of the things we do from a practice point of view in class when we have, if I'm showing reaction animation, is to stop at the end of the animation and ask students to write out what both the strengths and the limitations of that representation may be. And then from a research point of view, you asked, you were asking about, I guess, the cognitive load piece, the working memory piece, and extraneous and details. So we've played a little bit with looking at, do you get students to draw the full Lewis structure? I mean, we think that's too much, but do you have to draw them partly? Do you at least have them expand the reactive portion of the molecule? And so we played a little bit with trying to categorize difficulty of reaction by number of arrows, and we didn't really get that far with that. Right now, we are exploring that link to cognitive load and fluency with the symbolism through an eye tracking project. So that's something that's in progress in our group right now, that we have both a postdoctoral fellow and an honors student who are working on that.
Yep. Okay. Great. So,
And then you asked the pre-plan as
yep.
we go. So do you want to jump in there, or do you want to talk about the pre-plan?
Your eye tracking has already asked another question. There were some practice-focused questions. One was in terms of the assessment, which I think you addressed. Do you award for the product, or do you award for the showing of mechanisms? Do you use multiple choice questions in assessing organic mechanisms? And then there was a kind of an outcomes question. Has seeing how different presentations affect students' interpretation, do you change, for example, things like how you teach intermolecular forces? So lots of kind of, I suppose, what are the practical outcomes of this in terms of assessment and teaching?
Absolutely. Okay, so do we assess for the product or the mechanisms? Both. So say we're asking students to propose a full mechanism, it might be a 6 to 10 mark question. About 2 points would be for getting to the product. The rest of the points are for the mechanism and for the thinking along the way. So students might actually propose an incorrect mechanism, but that remains plausible. So we try to almost use a rubric to make judgments as to the plausibility of their mechanism and give points accordingly. In terms of our exams, there are, and in fact, I thank Mark, who's one of the postdoctoral fellows in the group, for doing this right beforehand, because I thought I might get a question like this. How much of our exams are multiple choice? So I asked him to take a look so I could actually have some numbers in front of me. So there typically is one midterm that is about 25% multiple choice, but the rest is less than 15% multiple choice. The rest is short or long answer, justify. There tends to be a lot of draw the mechanism types of questions.
And one other minor question was, when you say expand the structure, do you mean turn it from the condensed form into the skeletal form, is it?
That's right. So yeah, the expanded structure, when the students are given, they're given the question as a line structure, and they're asked to expand at least the reactive portion of the molecule, or the parts of the molecule that are directly involved in the mechanism.
Great, yep. Okay, there are a few more hidden in there, but I think I'll, in the interest of time, I'll let you proceed on to the next part, but rest assured
there's
a lot of interest in what you've been speaking about so far.
Super, thanks, Erin. That's really exciting. I wish we could be a big group right now and actually be talking about all these things, because that would be a lot of fun. You did ask, do we pre-plan that alignment piece, or do we do it as we go?
Yes.
We do pre-plan it, but I've yet to see it remain unchanged. So we're just continually going back and saying, you know what, we asked this, but we think we'd get something more powerful if we did this in a different way. And so we're continually adjusting as we go, and really thinking about why we're asking different questions, and do we go simple? Do we try to go bigger? Are we trying to do too much? How narrow should we go? So we're always trying to ask ourselves those kinds of questions.
Great. Okay. So the people whose questions I may have missed, I have made some extra notes, so they'll be the first that I come to at the end if we have some time. But I think, Alison, if you want to proceed on to your next section.
Sure. Absolutely. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah. So that next part then is around the reactivity and reactions, and that fact that we can present this list of reactions that's typically organized by functional group, and where we're trying to think about, or we've reorganized our curriculum to really try to emphasize the patterns of reactivity. So this is an overview of the curriculum that gets described to students at the start of the course, where we start with structure, and then talk about the curved arrows, that language piece, acid-base, as we would typically do at the start of an organic course. And then we try to get into just patterns of reaction. So here I've shown in this top row over to the right a carbonyl reacting with a nucleophile, but that could be an imine. We could be forming an hemiacetal. So we try to keep it just simple nucleophile, electrophile, one-step type connections. Then we get into reactions of pi nucleophiles. So we start with alkenes, alkynes, and then move into aromatic nucleophiles. And then only in the second semester of organic chemistry, so we have a 2-semester organic chemistry course here, then we get into those E1, E2, SN1, SN2 reactions, a little bit more structure, and then sort of more advanced carbonyl reactions, acetals, which are really carbonyl reactions that just have a hidden leaving group or a hidden carbonyl to them. and then back into those alkene type reactions, only this time with sort of souped up nucleophiles because they're the enols or enolates or enamines. And then we actually have an organic 3 course that really goes into more depth into all these ideas, more molecular orbital theory, and then palladium catalyzed cross-coupling reactions. And then we do also have a 4th year single semester organic synthesis course. That's a more traditional type of synthesis course. So our teaching is organized this way, and our curriculum is organized this way, and we might give an overview of the curriculum at the start of the course, but we were questioning if the students are organizing their thinking this way at all, and also if professors, were teaching this way, but is their thinking actually in this kind of way also, or are experts thinking in a different way? So these are some of the things that we wanted to start exploring. And so our specific research questions then were, how do students organize organic chemistry reactions in a patterns of mechanisms curriculum? And what features do students attend to when organizing these reactions? We also wondered from students, novice students to more senior and advanced students, all the way to professors, what would that look like? And so we decided to create a card sort task with chemical reactions on cards, almost like playing cards, and give participants in our studies the stacks of these cards to organize. And so each card has a chemical reaction on it. And the way the overview of this project looks then is that we had to develop those reaction cards, and we received ethics approval, of course. We piloted the interview guide that included the cards, and that led to some revisions. Then we conducted interviews, and we had 34 participants. I'll break those down in a couple of minutes. And then we analyzed the vast amounts of data that came from all of this. So going into developing those cards, we talked about this so much because there are so many decisions to make about what to include in these cards. We decided to include mechanisms from across our organic 1 and 2 semesters. We had to decide about functional groups, so most of the cards have a few different functional groups on them. We have a mixture of intra and intermolecular reactions. We do have cards with implicit atoms that are reacting, so we decided not to draw Lewis structures, for example. We have line structures. Stereochemistry is drawn explicitly on some of the cards. Most of the reactions are familiar, but there are a couple that would be unfamiliar probably to the students. Around deciding to show whether to show mechanisms or products, we decided not to show either. We didn't want to cue the participants to thinking about mechanisms, so that's why we had that particular choice. And we decided not to show products to explore more whether they would be product oriented, and also because it reflected more what students would be seeing on their exams, as being asked to predict the product and not being shown the product. Then we did decide to include solvents and specify which species were acting as the solvent, in the same way that we could go look in an experimental section and figure out what was acting as the solvent if we didn't already know from our experience. Because students don't have that experience yet, we think it's fair to share with them what species is acting as the solvent in that given reaction. So then we wanted to look at more carefully at the test content. So we consulted experts who were present in the department, and we asked them some specific questions. So we shared quite a list of reactions that we thought we were going to put on these reaction cards with them. And we didn't want to just ask them, what do you think? We wanted to be pretty specific in the questions that we were asking. So first we asked if these reactions would work in the lab setting, if they were appropriate reactions for organic chemistry to students, and if they saw any issues with the reactions, so solvent incompatibilities, competing reactions, anything that might be problematic as we went forward with this. So then we did a pilot study. After all of that, we came back and settled on 25 reaction cards. And what you're seeing here is the organization, the way that we've categorized these reactions based on our curriculum and the labels that we've given to them. And we've also, just for the cards that students or participants are seeing, they're just seeing the letter on the cards themselves. So you can get a sense of what kind of reactions these things what these would look like. So then to our participants, so we had Organic Chemistry 2 students. So we had 16 of those. We had graduate students who are working in organic chemistry research groups, 10 of those. So we had 4 master's students and 6 PhD. And it's quite common in the Canadian context to have quite a large number of both master's and PhD students. And then we had 7 professors who were either conducting research in organic chemistry or teaching in organic chemistry. So for the interview task, I'll be focusing on task 1, which was to sort the cards however you would like. And we gave the participants only 15 of the 25 cards. And then for task 2, we gave them 10 more cards and asked them to either incorporate into their existing categories or to completely rearrange if they wanted to. And then it was very key not to just look at that, because we wouldn't need to do interviews if we were just asking them to categorize and say taking a picture of their end categories. We were looking at the process they were using. We're also asking participants to do the categories they created, explain how these reactions fit together, and describe their sorting process. So we really want to understand what participants are thinking as they're working through this task. So one of the ways that we visualized the sorts was using a program called Gephi. And so Gephi puts all the cards that are, you're looking at the card labels as called nodes. And the lines between nodes or between the labels indicate that those 2 cards, for example, have been sorted in the same category together. The thinner the line, the fewer the participants have sorted together. So the line between F and M, 2 participants put together. The thicker the line, the more participants have sorted those 2 cards in the same category. So for example, 11 participants sorted N and E together. So this is the look for the Organic Chemistry 2 students. And so you can see the many different ways that they sorted reactions by the number of different lines that we're looking at. Now if we compare that then to the professors, we can do sort of a bird's eye view to start and see globally that there's more lines for the Organic Chemistry 2 students than professors. There are also more students than professors, but we can also see that the professors fall into fewer groups than the students. Then if we dive into some of the specifics. So for example, group A, G, J, the professors pretty much sorted those 3 into their own group, whereas students had a bit more differences in some of the sorting that they did, especially for J. And the next one is H. So if you look at how the students sorted H, it's put into many different categories, whereas H for the professors was largely sorted with N and then with some other things. So H was especially sorted with N on the professor's side, which was also often placed in a group with E. So next one, C and L. Are they at the top there? So placed together much of the time by many of the professors, and C and L over for the students, again in a wide variety of categories. And the last couple here, so D, K, and O, pretty much put together for the students, or at least much more than professors, who had sort of a larger group that those cards were placed in. And I think the very last one here that'll come up is M. So M was pretty much placed on its own by professors. It was pretty much the only, in this task 1, the pure acid-base reaction, where it was placed in a number of different categories by the students. So then we know what categories the participants have made, but we don't know the why yet. We don't know how they're describing their categories. We don't know. We might make guesses based on our own experiences of why these groups go together, and you may be making decisions for yourself of whether or not these should go in the same category or not, or whether you might have different categories. But we really wanted to hear from the participants to hear their reasons for it. And as we did that, we found 4 main levels that participants were using for their categories, as well as an I don't know kind of category. So the first one was that some participants sorted by identical structure. This was a very surface level type of sorting, just identical structural features with no further interpretation. So these ones have chlorine, and that was it. The next one were the properties of those structures. So still pretty static, but now there was some interpretation of the structure to identify common characteristics, like a strong base, the way that it might act, but not really process-oriented yet. The third one then is by type of reaction. So interpreting the structure to think about reactivity, how the species might interact, how these two react together. Participants often named a reaction type or what would happen during the reaction. And the last one, which we might think of as the highest one, also process-oriented, is by a type of mechanism. So here, reading the reaction for interpretation more at the molecular level. So what is happening with the electrons, what bonds are forming, what bonds are breaking, and to code a participant's response in this category, we had some very specific language that we were looking for so that we weren't assuming anything further than what the participants themselves had really said. And so when we looked at who sorted in which kind of categories, we saw that professors and PhDs sorted in the type of mechanism and type of reaction kind of category. And all the participants from the profs and the PhDs at one point had sorted in the type of mechanism. And then the students were really spread out over all the four categories, with type of mechanism being the major way that they sorted the cards. So we also want to think about the trustworthiness of our data. So we've done all this analysis of qualitative data. How do you know? We can't. It's not like counting the number of apples on a table. How do we know that these interviews and this data that we've analyzed is trustworthy? So we did quite a number of things to help share or help improve or convince of the trustworthiness of our data. So peer debriefing was something that we would do at least weekly, was talk about the codes, talk about the data, go through specific examples, discuss. There would be at least two of us, if not more, talking about this. We also looked at negative case analysis. So if there was a claim that we were thinking of making or ready to make, we would go back through the data and try to find ways to disprove ourselves or prove ourselves wrong. So that's what negative case analysis can look like. Then we want to give thick descriptions so that as a reader, as an audience, typically we'd be showing quotes. We would be certainly in the manuscripts that we've prepared, we have many, many quotes, describing as thoroughly as we can so that the person taking a look at this data, this analysis, can make decisions for themselves whether or not they would come to the same conclusions or findings. And certainly we provide as much evidence as we can in the form of quotes. So those are the two that I'll focus on for now. The other thing that we did was a type of inter-rater, inter-coder analysis. And so to do that, we selected 10% of the data, selected the codes to try to compare, and then we had a second rater come in and do some coding using NVivo, so a qualitative analysis software, compared the codes between the two, and then discussed areas both of matching and of mismatching. And some of the advice that came from that, while the group doing that had discussed the codes ahead of time, I think they would have wanted to do more of a subsample before going through, so training the coder, and also to create a more formal template. So NVivo can get, with the number of codes we had, it was dozens and dozens of codes. So I think it would have been more straightforward. And eventually the group landed on having a template to do this coding. So conclusion from this section then, so from those organic chemistry students, we saw they had diverse categories they used, the majority sorted by reaction type. Professors all had similar categories and all sorted mechanistically, at least at one point, although they did use different terms sometimes to describe some of the mechanisms that they were using. In terms of next steps, so we're conducting right now a larger scale card study now that we have a better idea of what we're looking for from the qualitative data. We're conducting designing and conducting a broader curriculum evaluation, and we have Mark Raycroft, a postdoctoral fellow, who's leading that, who's been supported by Tyler White over the summer. And the fun part, one of the most fun parts, I think, is integrating these findings into classroom activities and assessments. So to give you some idea of what we might be doing, one thing is asking students to categorize reactions that they're seeing. So we're not just describing the curriculum to them, we're asking them to come up with to categorize as well. So it can be their own categories, or it can be a more framed sort like this one is, of where we give them the categories and we ask them to choose. So this is an example that was used in class when students were asked to do this. The majority said that this fit into category B, although still a large number of students said that this would fall into category D, which led to a great classroom discussion about the nucleophilic species and what part of the nucleophile was reacting. So there's some great fodder for discussion there. Another one that was asked here was this one, where there's both sort of an aromatic and then an alkene. At first, most of the students said D. Then we asked a little bit further, and a couple of students pointed out that there are two types of nucleophiles present, both the aromatic type nucleophile and the alkene type nucleophile. Students voted on what the strongest nucleophile would be, and the majority answered B. There was still quite the classroom discussion around this. Now, the other thing that we haven't done in these categorization questions is really asking students to justify why these reactions are happening. And so here we get really inspired by people like Vicente Telencare and Melanie Cooper's group and Nicole Becker and Marcy Towns, who work on getting students to argue and arguing with data and justifying their answers. So these are some of the things that we're starting to incorporate into our class. So getting students, for example, in A, to propose a mechanism for the reaction that they see, and then to consider the other related mechanism they see, to justify their choice of mechanism and include a comparison to a mechanism that they haven't proposed. Now, we're finding that students still stick at the surface level. I see a strong base, and so that's why this would be an E2 reaction, and an E1 takes a weak base. Well, that gets at sort of the surface level feature, but we really want to get students to go deeper, and so we're trying to expand on these kinds of questions and be more clear with the expectations that a complete answer would need to go beyond the surface features and include things like the rate determining step, using a reaction coordinate diagram, things like that, to get further into the answers. I'm going to skip over that one. So just to wrap up these two projects that I've relatively quickly gone over. So we talked about trying to get students, helping students become more fluent with this organic chemistry language. And then some of the findings that have come from that. They're being processed, they're thinking in a process-oriented way with some of fewer surface types of errors, but they're having challenges with intramolecular reactions, implicit atoms. We're seeing opportunities to help them develop their mental models, but we're seeing sort of a stepwise kind of thinking. And certainly the students need practice, feedback, and assessment to demonstrate the value of these kinds of questions. And then we've just briefly talked about this patterns of reactions project that we've been working on, and where we found 4 main types of categories that participants had, students had made, and then 2 main that were the PhDs and profs fell under. Differences between levels of expertise, certainly the need for practice and assessment. In our practice, trying to develop question types around these kinds of ideas and intended learning outcomes, and also trying to build in these how and why type questions right into these typical ones or more surface level ones that we might ask. So with that, I'm going to thank all of our funding sources, the fantastic people who work in the group, who are just phenomenal to work with, collaborators and people who offer support to our group. Thank you so much for all of that. Thank you so much to all of you who have been here today. This is really wonderful. And I'm going to turn it back over to Michael to tell us what we do next.
I will turn on my audio first of all, and then so we have again a whole raft of questions. If I can, we have about 10 minutes left, a short of 10 minutes. So I have a few questions coming in. So sorry, they're coming in thick and fast. Okay, so maybe I'll start. One question was around these cards. First of all, this was a subset of students you were trialing these with in an experimental setting, was it, rather than a classroom setting?
That's right.
Yeah, great. And what was the rationale between getting them to do, say, 15 cards first and then 10 rather than just giving them 25? Was that a cognitive load issue, or?
Yeah, well, you've exactly got it. So I feel like you planted that question because I had a slide in our pilot study that I removed. So when we did the pilot study, we did originally give them all 25 cards, and we found that the students were just really overwhelmed by it. We even had a fourth-year student involved in, or third or fourth-year student involved in the pilot study who was, it was really just too much. And so we decided from that point that we would start with the 15, and that was that would be a more manageable number, and then it would be easier at that point to incorporate the 10 after that.
Great. There was when you're choosing the cards, do you use named reactions, or is it just, do you say this is the Michael addition was suggested, or do you just show the actual chemical reaction? In other words, are you bringing in the issue around naming of reactions, which is common in organic chemistry?
So we didn't provide the names of any of the reactions, although certainly many of our participants named them. So calling it a Grignard reaction, or this would be an SN2 reaction, or things. So that came out from our participants. When we were deciding on the cards, we looked at essentially that overview slide that I showed of our curriculum, and we essentially had a grid of all the different reactions that we might use and all the different criteria, and we just wanted to make sure that we had at least a few examples from all the different kinds of reactions that we have in our curriculum.
Yeah. I mean, it must have been quite a challenge getting just 25. One question just related that has come in, Natalia. The graduate students. So you talked about students and you talked about professors. Where did the graduate students fit in this analysis?
Yes. This is another one of my hidden slides. This is part of our technical issues that I couldn't upload the hidden slides. So thank you for that. That's such a great question. So the professors and the PhD students were the most similar. So if we look at their sorts, the PhDs were really smaller number of groups and quite similar to what we saw in the professors, whereas the master students were much more similar to the organic chemistry 2 students, and that came through in it's quite clear to see when we compare side by side all the Gephi plots, and even when we look at the way that the participants are describing the reactions and describing their categories, is really an interesting divide there that we found, and we were actually quite surprised to find that, although people keep telling me that we shouldn't be that surprised, but I remain surprised.
And then again, probably slightly related is Ira's question. Could you give an example for the difference between sorting for type of mechanism versus type of reaction?
Absolutely. So type of mechanism would be more like more similar to naming the type of reaction, or speaking about the 2 species that would be coming together, or that one group, a nucleophile, would be substituting for a leaving group. So those things are still process oriented if we talk about a nucleophile coming in, a leaving group leaving, but to be categorized or coded as being mechanistic, we really expect to see, that these electrons are going to be forming this bond here, and this bond is going to be breaking, or speaking about orbital overlap, or a much more finer grained, much more detailed, I guess, kind of explanation. I'd be happy to share the actual description of the codes that we use when we did that. We have those as well.
Right. Yep. I mean, something, and just related to another question. A lot of the terminology you're using when we teach is implicit to us. It's sort of words that we know, but I suppose especially at school level, but at early undergraduate level, how do we actively make those words explicit in students' minds in terms of the capable dialogue?
Well, I think it's interesting. There's part of that scientific language that let me start the opposite way. I think we do a lot of things that students pick up on really quickly and easily that I think we should be getting out of our language, the teleological kind of reasoning, these nucleophiles attacking electrophiles, and what atoms want, for example, and all these kinds of things that students repeat really, really nicely on exams. But how do we get ourselves digging further and getting more scientific explanations to this? It's not what they want or what they see across the room. And students know that. If we actually challenge them on that kind of idea, like, oh, of course not. Okay, of course it's not an atom choosing where it wants to go, but how do we explain that? And how can we understand that? And what data do we have to support that? So I think by talking about these things, by explaining what we mean, they can learn it. But we have a responsibility to model it in the words that we use and asking for it in the assessments that we have. I think we have a big responsibility. We have the responsibility perhaps for that.
Yeah. And one of the things I like about your activities is that it is focusing on that verbalizing and using that kind of language. Another question about, sorry that they're flying in, did you look at how groupings evolved over the course of activities? So in other words, I guess the question means, as students tried more grouping activities, did they become better at grouping? Did they become more professor-like, I suppose? I think, Carl,
Right.
hopefully
Yeah.
that's what you're asking.
So in fact, so we didn't in that initial study. That is something that we are looking at now, how perhaps we're going to see expertise develop, or maybe our capture points are going to be too short that we won't see it develop in a relatively short period of time. But at the same time as we're doing a larger scale card sort study, we're also having multiple capture points so that we can at least look for any kind of development of that expertise over time.
Yeah. And I have two more questions I think I'll take before we'll have to wrap it up. One was, it's come up a few times actually, this idea about getting students to identify nucleophile and electrophile. Do you find students struggle with that, those terms and what they mean? Is it, well, A, what they are, I guess, and B, what it means in terms of organic chemistry?
So one of the other things that we looked for in the study was the kind of terminology that students were using as they described these different levels. And one of the things we found over 75% of students were using were the terms nucleophile and electrophile. In fact, it was one of the most commonly used terms, and they were doing so correctly. Similarly, on assessment exam questions, there are assessment questions asking students to identify the nucleophile and electrophile. They don't struggle in so much in identifying a nucleophile or a nucleophilic atom or an electrophilic atom. The struggle comes more with trying to rank relative reactivity. So if the question is, circle the most nucleophilic atom in this larger molecule with multiple functional groups, the students are good at identifying a single nucleophilic atom, but not necessarily the most nucleophilic one. And so I think certainly we've overcome that first hump of getting those terms being comfortable, and now it's getting to the point of that relative reactivity place that we're trying to get to.
Yeah. Okay, and then the last question is, I suppose your final slide here is showing a huge number of people who've been involved in this. Part of our remit as the Chemistry Education Research Group is activating and encouraging people about research. How do you get to this stage? I mean, do you think this is a necessary model, or do you think people, obviously people who maybe are working in smaller departments can make some contribution? I mean, how do you get to the stage to be Alison Flynn? I mean, how do you become more active in research?
I try to look at successful groups and try to copy the things that they're doing. To be quite honest with you, I think we have some amazing role models internationally that we can look to, and some really incredible groups. And I take, frankly, every opportunity that I can to ask them about how they run their group, both the students within the groups and the supervisors, thinking about the philosophies going in both directions. So. Can you make an impact as a small single person, or as a small group with the undergrads? I think absolutely. Certainly in Canada, our context is that it's been relatively unusual to have graduate students or postdoctoral fellows, but we are seeing that growing. That more and more groups, more and more institutions are recognizing what chemistry education research can do and how it can impact practice. And I think as a result that we're seeing those kinds of groups growing. So that to me is really exciting to see.
Yeah, but quite a lot of your work is co-authored with undergraduate, project students, isn't it? You have involved a lot of project students in your work.
Absolutely. So until 2 years ago, it was all undergraduate students that I was working with, and I feel like I got really lucky with just great people who were ready to learn and working hard, and great environment in the group. So, and it's only been recently that having postdoctoral fellows and graduate students, and I have to say, I don't know how this happened exactly, but the people in the group really help each other out and offer reading suggestions to each other and consult each other. And it's, if you can make that happen in your group, I can't tell you how that worked, but maybe you can ask my group members how they do it, because it's just an amazing thing to see people helping each other like that.
Okay, well, Alison, the questions are flowing in, but I'm afraid our hour is up. So I'll just thank you very much for your time. And I mean, delivering a webinar with the passion that you have given it is very difficult. So I really appreciate the effort you put in and sharing so much of your work with us. I will just end by sharing my opening slide if I can, just to say that we've been hearing from Alison about a lot of her work in organic reaction mechanisms. This is the start of a series of webinars from the Chemistry Education Research Group. And the next one, we're continuing on a very high caliber of speakers. Our next speaker is Keith Tabor on December the 6th. So you can see details on the website. So I'm sure if there's virtual applause and I see a lot of thank yous and things coming in the chat room. So thank you, thank you very much, Alison.
And if I can say, yeah, thank you, folks, all of you who have participated. And if you do have other questions or you want to discuss or you have suggestions, I absolutely welcome them. So whether it's through Twitter or email or we catch up with each other in person at a conference, I absolutely welcome it. And thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you everybody for joining in. I hope the technical problems weren't too difficult, but I saw a peak of about 75 people, so I definitely had a lot of our attendees attending, so or our registrants attending. So thank you all very much for coming along, and the messages are flowing in, so I will try and copy those and send them to you, Alison, to share the virtual applause that's happening. So thanks very much. I'll stop recording now so we can say what we like then, and then we can.
Yeah.